Hola a todos, soy Javier Poveda y esto es De Bien TV, el canal en el que te lo vas a pasar de bien mientras aprendes geografía, historia e historia del arte. En el vídeo de hoy, que va dirigido a mis alumnos de sección de segundo de la ESO del IES Niel Armstrong de Valdemoro, vamos a ver el tema siguiente, que es el tema 10. Como siempre, antes de empezar, espero que estéis todos muy bien y que estéis llevando el confinamiento de la mejor manera posible. So today we are going to start and we are going to finish the unit 10, which is world population and cities. So let's go to the presentation. Here we are. And sorry, this is the unit we are going to study. It is a short unit because we are only going to see the specific data of every continent in the world, the specific data about demographic indicators, which we have studied in the unit 7 or 8, and the cities in these continents, which we studied in unit 9. So this is going to be just a short unit, and we are going to take a general look about how population is distributed and how cities are in these continents, in all the continents in the world except for Europe and for Spain, because we are going to study those ones specifically in the next units, which are 11 and 12. So let's start. Here you have a map of the population density all over the world. The more intense the color is, the higher the population density is in those areas. So we are going to study with Africa, and we have to know that in Africa the population is over 1200 million inhabitants. Okay, we have to distinguish two main regions in Africa, which are North Africa and the Sub-Saharan Africa. The North Africa is all this area here north of the Sahara Desert, and this is called the Maghreb, which is Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and then Libya and Egypt. These areas is an area of Muslim tradition because the Muslims are settled here since the 7th and the 8th century, as we have studied in the history units. And the other area is all of this one is the rest of Africa, all of this, which I am pointing here in the map with the mouse, which is all the area south of the Sahara Desert. So, which are the main demographic indicators in Africa? Are these ones here. Do we need to know the specific numbers, the specific rates of all these demographic indicators? No, we don't need to memorize that. In Africa the RNI is 2.6, the crude birth rate is 35.8. No, we don't need to know the specific numbers, but we have to know that the rate of natural increase in Africa is very high, according to the measures we have studied in previous units, that the crude birth rate is very, very high, is 35.8 per mil, which is a very high birth rate, that the crude death rate is around 10, which is a normal, an average rate, and that the total fertility rate, which doesn't appear in the book, I have searched it, is 4.7. The total fertility rate, if you remember, is the average number of children per woman. Okay, so for every woman in Africa, every woman in a fertility age, which is between 15 and 49 years old, and they have 4.7 children, which is a lot. Okay, so how is it the demographic growth? It's the typical of less developed countries, which means they have a high birth rate, they have a low death rate. So if we have a lot of births and a few deaths, the natural increase is going to be very high. Okay, that's the reason here we have a 2.6%. So we have also a young population, a population that is growing very fast, and which the bigger or the biggest group age are the younger ones, so it's at the base of the population pyramid. How is the net migration rate? So it is negative. It means that more people leaves the continent than the ones who arrive. Why is that? Because people is searching for new opportunities of life. Because Africa is the poorest continent in the world, so people usually leave Africa in order to search for better opportunities of life. For example, we have the example that we know and that we see not now on these days, but in other years, many people, for example, crosses or tries to go through the Strait of Gibraltar to arrive to Europe. Why? Because in Europe you have more chances to find a job. Or, for example, the refugees who come here from Libya and they try to arrive to Italy, or from Italy or from Tunisia. Okay. And also the reasons are the inequality, so there's a very few rich people and a vast majority of poor people, and the limited resources, so there is not enough to share with everybody. And finally, the population distribution. We have a density of 40 inhabitants per kilometer square, which is a low density. Why is that? Because there's a lot of population here in Africa. We have said over 1,200 million or over 1,200 million, but Africa is a very a large country. It's a very extensive area, so the population density is low. What are the most densely populated areas? Pues, they are the coasts and river valleys, the Gulf of Guinea and the African Great Lakes. The Gulf of Guinea is this one here, and this area, as you can see, is one of the most populated in Africa. Also, the coast and river valleys. Here you can see the coast of Maghreb of Northern Africa, or the coast here in the southeast Africa. It's a very densely populated area. And also the area around the African Great Lakes. These are these ones, Lake Victoria, Lake Malawi, etc. Okay, this area here and also this area here, which we have some lakes, are the more densely populated areas. Also the valley of the great rivers. What is the best example here? The area here of the valley of the river Nile. Okay, in Egypt, for example, as you can see, this is Egypt. The people are concentrated and they live next to the banks of the river, okay, of the Nile. This is why Egypt has this area very densely populated, because it's the only area in the country where you can live, where you can live from agriculture. And what are the sparsely populated areas, the less populated areas? The areas of the deserts. Here we have this vast area, which is the Sahara Desert, which is impossible to live in. These areas here you can see that have some population is because there are some oases or some oil extraction infrastructures or military bases. And also the Namibia and Kalahari deserts, which is this one here, okay, in the southwest of Africa. So how are the cities in Africa? First, we have to take a look at the urban population. In Africa, around 40% of the population lives in cities. This is the lowest percentage in the world, comparing with other continents. Why? Because most of the population live in poorly developed areas. Remember that Africa is the poorest country, the poorest continent, in the world. The poor rural workers migrate to the cities and they settle in enormous slums surrounding the cities. If you remember from the Unit 9, the slums are those areas around the cities with poor quality housing. So for example, here in these two photographs, we have two examples of African cities, and you can see here we have wealthy areas where there are single housing, and this is for wealthy people, also middle income areas, and this is a huge slum area with very narrow streets. It is very crowded and it has poor transport infrastructure. Here you have another example. if you have to live in one of these areas, one of these or of this one or this one, I am sure you will choose this one here on the top. So how it is the urban structure in African cities? They have more or less a similar structure, which are they have a European district, which was built by Europeans during the colonial period. In the early 20th century, almost all the African continent was occupied by Europeans. Okay, they were all the countries were colonies of the European countries. The British, the French, the Spanish, the Belgians, and the Germans. So we have a European district, we have a CBD, a central business district with modern buildings and green areas. We have residential estates with single-family housing for wealthy people, for example, this area here, and the slums on the outskirts, on the outside areas, the exterior areas of the cities where the poor people live. Here we have the slums. And how is the urban system? So we have the African coastal cities and cities on the banks of rivers are well communicated, and they are the centers of industrial and economic activities. And there are these few large cities exercise great influence over the rest, which are smaller national cities. So we have a few big cities or important cities such as Cairo or Nairobi or Addis Ababa or Cape Town or Johannesburg. And these few cities, they are very important cities, and they exercise a great influence all over the rest of the cities in Africa, which are smaller national cities. If you remember the urban hierarchy, we have the global cities, the national cities, and the regional cities. So most of the African cities are national cities, and we can consider that there are a couple of more or less global cities, such as Cairo or Cape Town. So this is all for Africa, and we go to America. In America, the population is almost 1,000 million people, and we have two main regions. North America, which is Canada and the United States, so here to the north, okay? The United States and Canada, and then the rest, which is Latin America and the Caribbean, which are the countries who have strong ties to Spain and Portugal, because they were part of our empire during the modern age. So these are the demographic indicators. I have divided them between the two regions. So we have a very low natural increase in North America because they have a average birth rate, a low death rate, and 1.7 total fertility rate, which means, remember, the average number per women, the average number of children per woman. In Latin America and the Caribbean, which is this area here, Central America, the islands of the Caribbean, and all South America, the natural increase is a bit higher because their birth rate is way higher than the one in North America. The death rate is lower, and the total fertility rate is a bit higher. So the demographic growth in North America is the typical of developed countries, a low CBR, a low CDR, and RNI, with an aging population. Remember that an aging population means that there are more people who are 65 years old or older than young people, which are the people who are younger than 14 years old. And in Latin America and the Caribbean, the demographic growth is similar to or typical of the less developed countries, the same as in Africa. The net migration is uneven because it is negative in Latin America and the Caribbean and positive in North America. Why is that? Because many people in Latin America and the Caribbean migrate to North America. Okay? Why? Because in Latin America and the Caribbean, the population growth is higher, and there are not enough resources for everyone. So many people go migrate to mostly to the United States. I am sure you have seen in the news all these Mexican people who are trying to cross the wall that separates Mexico from the United States here. So many people try to reach the United States and Canada because there are many more job opportunities there. The population density in North America is 18.5 and in Latin America is 32.4. It's almost double. And the population distribution is more or less 2/3 in Latin America and the Caribbean and 1/3 in North America. So how are the cities in America? America has, or is the continent which has the most urban population of the world. It is around 80% of the population, of the total population. So 8 out of 10 people in America lives in a city. How is the urban structure? Well, in North American cities, we have a CBD with skyscrapers and green spaces. Here you have a picture of Manhattan in New York. Some of them, which the first colonies that the British founded in modern age, have a historic center, and then around it there are a lot of residential estates, which are large and wealthy areas. Remember, wealthy means richness, okay? If you have a lot of money, you are richer. Where the middle class people live. We can see this in every movie that you can see on the TV. That many people of the middle class of the United States lives in these areas with single housing. Okay. And in Latin American cities, they have a CBD, they have a historic center which was built during the colonial period, because we the Spanish built we always build a historic center, a big square in the center of the cities in which the main buildings were located, such as the cathedral or the cabildo. And then we have a couple of residential rings around it. Then first we have a small residential estate for the wealthy people, and then a very extensive residential area with poor, there's an O missing here, with 2 O's, poor quality housing, where the majority of the population lives. For example, here this is a picture of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Here we have a residential estate for wealthy people. As you can see here, a very wide avenue and large flat buildings and very tall flat buildings. And here we have this area of poor quality housing, which we can consider also slums, such as in Africa. Okay, for example, in Brazil they are called favelas. If you have played Call of Duty Modern Warfare, there's a map which is called favelas, and you can see how the housing is. So how is the urban system in cities in North America maintain strong links with each other and form large megalopolises, such as the Northeast megalopolis and the Great Lakes megalopolis. For example, these megalopolises, we studied them in Unit 9 when we talk about megalopolis and conurbation, if you remember, and I showed you a photo of the megalopolis of Boswas, which is a continuous city from Boston to Washington. That is the Northeast megalopolis. And also the Great Lakes megalopolis is the one which goes from Chicago to Pittsburgh, which is called TPITS. And in Latin America, we have just a few global cities. We can name, for example, Mexico, DF, or Buenos Aires, or Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo in Brazil. Okay, and this is all for America. Then we have Asia. Asia is the most populated continent in the world with over 4,300 million inhabitants. We have several regions because Asia is a very diverse continent, and we can name the Western Asia, which is the Middle East, Central Asia, Southeast Asia here, South Asia, which is India, and Eastern Asia, the China and Japan, and Northern Asia, which is the Asian part of the Russian Federation. So what are the demographic indicators here? We have a low natural increase. We have an average birth rate, which varies a lot between the regions. For example, it's 20 per mil in Western Asia, but only 12 per mil in Eastern Asia. The CDR is very low, with 7 per mil in average, but in regions, for example, in the Middle East, it is only 5.3 per mil, and the total fertility rate is 2.1. So the demographic growth varies a lot according to the region. For example, in the Middle East, the population is growing a lot because they are receiving a lot of migrants. But, for example, in Eastern Asia, in China, the antinatalist policies have resulted in an aging population. The antinatalist policies is the policy of the one son, the one children, that established Mao Zedong, which is the communist leader who founded the People's Republic of China, in which you could only have one children per family. He did this to try to stop the uncontrolled population growth that China was experimenting. So the net migration is negative in general. People leave the continent, but it varies. For example, in the Middle East, it's positive because many workers come here because it's a region which is developing a lot and very fast. For example, the United Arab Emirates, which are building a lot of cities with skyscrapers, and they need people, and also because it's the most important oil producing region in the world, so they need workers. So those companies that are located there attract a lot of workers from other continents. And for example, is negative in poor rurals of Central and South Asia. For example, in rural areas here, people tend to migrate from these regions in search for better opportunities of life. The population density in average is a bit higher than 100 inhabitants per kilometer square, but it also varies a lot. For example, here in the South and East Asia, which is the most densely populated area in the continent, it is very high. It is around 150 inhabitants per kilometer square, but in the rest of the continent it is very low. It is around 25 inhabitants per kilometer square. The population distribution is the 80% of the population live in South and East Asia. Okay, as you can see here in the map, the most populated countries of the world are India and China. So it is expected that they have the most population density rate of the continent, and also Indonesia. And the less densely populated areas are here the deserts here in Arabia or in Central Asia, or the polar area of Siberia in the Russian Federation. So how are the cities in Asia? The percentage of urban population is a bit less than the 50%, but it is rapidly increasing. The urban structure varies depending on the history of the country. For example, we have a historic center with irregular street with this capital letter is also a typo patterns in Muslim, Indian or Indonesian population, but a grid street pattern in Chinese cities. Here you have a Muslim city. This is Nablus in Palestine, and this is the city center of Beijing. Here the streets are, well, you cannot see it very well, but you can imagine that the streets are very narrow and very irregular shape. But here in China, in Chinese city, they used to build cities with a grid pattern. A grid is what we call in Spanish a cuadrícula. Okay, and you can see here. Then some cities have European districts that were built by European colonists because many parts of Asia, many territories of Asia were also colonized by the European empires during the 19th and 20th century. And then we have a CBD with modern high-rise buildings. Here you have the CBD of Tokyo, and residential estates for wealthier people. All of these residential areas. And also we have large slum areas surrounding the city. I didn't have enough space for more photos of the slums, but they are similar to the ones that we have seen in America and Africa. The urban system in Asia includes mega cities, which are very, very large cities with millions of inhabitants, such as Tokyo, the capital of Japan, Beijing, the capital of China, or Hong Kong. They are global cities with close links to other ones in the world. These three cities are the most important ones in Asia, and they are most of the most important financial and economic centers of the world. And then we have medium-sized cities with an administrative role, with a national role within the national urban hierarchy. And finally, we are going to finish the unit with Oceania. Oceania is the fifth continent, is the less populated continent, with a population of around 39 million inhabitants. We have two main regions, which are the largest islands, which are Australia, New Zealand, and New Guinea, and then a bunch of millions of very little islands in the Pacific Ocean. The rate of natural increase is 1.1. The CBR is low except for the smaller islands, which is a bit higher. The CDR is very low and the total fertility rate is 2.4. The demographic growth is the typical of developed countries in Australia and New Zealand because they are in fact developed countries, and the typical of emerging countries. Both of these two models are similar to the ones that we have seen in Africa and North America, for example, in the rest of the islands. The net migration is positive in Australia and New Zealand because many people from the smaller islands migrate to these largest areas because they are the richest regions in the continent, and of course it's negative in the rest. The population density is very, very low. It's only 5 inhabitants per kilometer square as in the whole continent, okay, because there are many areas, most of them in Australia, because this is the Great Australian Desert, which are not inhabited because it is impossible to hold any economic activity there. So in the large islands, the population density is 3.6. As you can see here, the population in Australia is concentrated in the southeast regions of the island, and in Polynesia and Micronesia, which are the islands of the Pacific, the population density is very high. Why? Because they have a few population, but the area in which they live is very, very small. So that means that the population density rises a lot, and that is why its value is so high. The 72.5 of the population live in the largest islands in Australia and New Zealand, and the rest lives in the smaller ones. Around the 88% of the population in Australia lives in the cities here on the southeast, such as Sydney, Canberra, or Melbourne. In these countries, the largest cities organize the national territory. Okay, all this territory is organized from here, from these areas. And on the smaller islands, the main city is the seat of government of the authority. So in the smaller islands, they usually have a single city in the island, which is the economic and the political center, and in which the authorities live. So this is all for here. This is all for this unit. This is a short unit, and we don't need to stop here more than needed. Okay, so I repeat again, you don't need to memorize all the demographic indicators, but you need to know to know them compared to the other countries. For example, you need to know that Africa is the least urbanized continent in the world and America is the most one, or that the population density in the islands of the Pacific is way higher than the largest islands of Oceania. Okay? You only have to memorize the population, the inhabitants of each continent, but the rest is not necessary. You just have to know those data in a qualitative way, okay? Compared to the rest of the continents. So this is all for this unit. Esto es todo por la unidad 10. Así que en los próximos vídeos veremos, esta vez sí, de una manera mucho más profunda y mucho más pausada, el resto de indicadores demográficos para Europa y para España, porque eso nos interesan más, ya que son los que vivimos y con los que nos relacionamos más. Muchas gracias por ver el vídeo y espero que os haya ayudado para el estudio. Nos vemos en el próximo.